teaspoon of
Like a
sugar.
thing.
Well, we're still on
And a steak.
Okay.
And a steak. No.
It's very difficult. Teaspoon. All right, do my best.
Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome back for part 2 of the 5-part series, More Than 3,000 Years of Jewish History. I think we left off last time pretty much up to Jacob and his children. We discussed Abraham, the discovery of Abraham, really a whole new dimension in the world, and how he passed those ideas on to his child Isaac and ultimately on to Jacob and his children. And we left off pretty much with the beginning of the Jewish nation. Jacob and his children and his grandchildren. We know that they were referred to as Israel, the children of Israel. And ultimately, the name Israel was actually given to Jacob. We know the episode of the Torah where it discusses Jacob struggling with the angel. I'm not going to delve into the symbolism of that right now, but a very pivotal point in his life. And afterwards, he receives a blessing. The Torah tells us that the blessing given to Jacob was, no longer will it be said that your name is Jacob, but Israel. For you have struggled with the divine and with man and have overcome. The word Israel has a connotation of struggle. You've struggled with the divine, with man. He had a very turbulent life, Jacob, but ultimately he overcame. And it's not just referring to the past, the issues and the struggles and trials and tribulations that he himself went through, but it's also referring to the future. The fact that the nation of Israel, the descendants of Jacob, will encounter struggle along the way. They will face hurdles, because by definition what we are, like we spoke about last week, the representatives of God in the world, the bearers of the torch, in regards to bringing a higher level of morality, a higher level of reality. So by definition, we're going to have conflict. People aren't going to like us. So it's a prediction as well that by being part of the nation of Israel, we will face hard times, but ultimately we will overcome. And that's encompassed in the name Jacob, or really Israel, and that's why his descendants took that name, and they were the children of Israel. Interesting, Friday night, there's a custom that we give our children a blessing. The boys a blessing and the girls a blessing. The blessing we give to the girls is fairly straightforward. What do we say? May it be the will of God that you be like our foremothers. And we enumerate them. You would have assumed the blessing we give to the boys would be, you should be like our forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But we don't say that. Rather, we say to the boys, you should be like Ephraim and Manasseh. Ephraim and Manasseh, we're going to get to momentarily, they were the children of Joseph. Joseph being one of Jacob's 12 sons, living in Egypt, and we'll discuss momentarily how that transpired. But he was the first one to have children that were raised outside the land of Israel, away from the Jewish people. And Ephraim and Manasseh were brought up in Egypt. That was pretty much the main empire at the time, the power of the world, the highest point of civilization. So the idea when we give our sons the blessing, you should be like Ephraim and Manasseh, is you should be able, even living in a world where there's many influences and many philosophies that are very much not the same as Torah philosophy. Different ideas out there that are not at all parallel to what we believe. Nevertheless, you should have that strength and courage to be able to face those challenges and live up to the name Israel. You struggle, but you overcome. That was the nation of Israel, Jacob and his children and his grandchildren. And if you were to go in a time machine and put yourself back, this is over 32,000 years ago. The chart we had over here, this is about right here. Remember we said the second part of this started when Abraham came to the full realization of God. That was 2,000 years from the creation of the first human being. So right around here we have Jacob and his children and his grandchildren. If you were to go back in time and look at them, they would look very similar to other people living in Canaan. They probably wore the same type of outfits, the same kind of sandals, the same color robes, the same turbans, whatever they wore in their head. Externally speaking, they looked the exact same as everybody else. Internally, their perspective on life, their perspective on the world, was radically different. Because they had this tradition from Abraham, and it wasn't just an oral tradition, but actually Abraham himself wrote books. He was very prolific. He didn't publish, but he wrote little journals, and he passed those down, and he taught from those journals to his son Isaac and to Jacob, and they had this information. And this is what they would do. They would study the ideas that were discovered by Abraham, and they would delve more into these concepts and what Abraham's perspective of God was. So internally, they had a totally different perspective than anybody else alive at that time. A different perspective of God. Like we spoke about last time, Abraham's discovery of one God. It wasn't just a quantitative issue of 1 versus 45. It was a qualitative difference. His perception of God, by definition, was God is limitless. God is outside of time and space. There's no boundary. And therefore, based on a very different qualitative definition of God, he had a very different definition of a human being. In the primitive world, in the pagan world, because their view that there were many gods and many forces and they were in control of us, their picture of a human being was very different as well. We're basically servants to the gods. The gods control life. If they get angry, they'll send a massive hurricane Sandy our way. If they don't like us, they're not going to have the crops grow. And the only thing we could do is somehow pacify them and somehow make them happy to allow them to keep us alive and keep us healthy. That was the primitive perspective of what the human being was, based on their perspective of what God was, of what the gods were. So comes along Abraham and the children of Israel, and with their different perspective, radically different, a human being wasn't just a slave to the gods. A human being was actually a life form that was created in the image of God. It's a totally different picture of what a human being is. That's much more empowering. That means I'm not just a slave, I'm not just here to serve you, because from that perspective of a limitless, infinite, eternal God, God doesn't need us. God doesn't need us to serve Him or to make Him feel good about Himself. When we pray and we're praising God, Hakel, Hagadol, great and ultimate, God's not sitting there on His throne. Oh, stop it, you didn't have to say that. That was too much. Thank you, Lord. That's not our perspective of God, and that wasn't Abraham's perspective of God. And therefore the role of human beings was also radically different. So we have this nation, the children of Israel, who look similar to the other people living in Canaan at the time, but ultimately were living on a different universe. I once read an example trying to help us understand what the primitive mindset was, how they viewed the world. If you picture, take one of the science fiction movies or books about aliens coming down and clearly stronger than us. We have no chance. We don't even try to fight them. And they take over the entire planet, and they pretty much make us their slaves and use us for manual labor. That was what the primitive world thought of themselves. We're the slaves of the demons, of the gods, of the different forces out there. So this whole different perspective originated by Abraham and ultimately now part of the children of Israel, they were viewed as, like we spoke about last week, very radical, very different, very crazy. But that's who they were. We have Joseph, like we mentioned, one of the 12 brothers. The brothers don't like him and they sell him into servitude in Egypt. The second great understanding of that episode is very simple. Dad likes you more. He bought you the new red Porsche and we have a bunch of Chevrolets. It's not fair. We're jealous of you. We don't like you. Get rid of him. That's not what happened. The proof is the fact that these brothers themselves become the 12 tribes. The destiny of the Jewish people, the power and the accomplishments of the Jewish people come through these 12 men. So the assumption that they were just base, jealous little boys is not a valid one. So what actually took place? What took place was as follows. There's an idea in Jewish law, there's a status referred to as a rodef, literally a pursuer. Very simple idea, which basically states, if you see A chasing after B, trying to kill him or her, you, witnessing this, have an obligation, a moral obligation. I have to stop this from happening, and therefore I have to kill the pursuer. If the only way of preventing B from getting killed is by killing A, that's my moral obligation. That's the idea of a rodef. He's called a pursuer, and therefore we have to get rid of him. The brothers thought that Joseph had the status of a rodef. They felt he was a pursuer because of his visions, of his dreams, of his ideas of grandeur. They thought he was dangerous. And he might mess up. He might throw a monkey wrench in the destiny of the Jewish nation. He might be trying to grab more for himself and mess up the whole structure of how the 12 tribes are supposed to develop. So they thought the only way to take care of him would be to get rid of him. That's the only thing we could do for the safety of the Jewish people. Noble intentions. They were wrong. They didn't realize that for 20 years. But after many years, when they finally reunited with their brother, and they were surprised, they didn't realize at first who he was, as the Torah explains the whole episode. But then they had the realization, and he confronted them, one of the most dramatic passages probably in the entire Torah, where he looks at his brothers and he says, Ani Yosef, ha'od avichai, is my father still alive? And at that point, the brothers had this recognition, oh my gosh, we made a mistake. At that moment in time, they realized his dreams actually came true. What he had in mind really came to fruition. He does have a very central role, more than we thought originally. That's what happened. They had noble intentions. The truth is, if we go throughout history, we'll see many great people made many great mistakes based on noble intentions. Always trying to do the right thing. It's a mitzvah. I have to do this for the benefit of the Jewish people, for the sake of God, I have to do this. Many times those noble intentions could cause us to do very, very evil things. The idea of the person who killed Yitzchak Rabin, I don't think he was one of the greats. But what was his rationale? He was a religious man. You know what he said? I thought that Yitzchak Rabin was a rodef. He had the status of a pursuer because he was giving away part of Israel, and that was endangering Jewish lives, and therefore I killed him because I thought by doing that, that would be beneficial to the Jewish people. The man was crazy. But it's a classic example of taking something that's real and misapplying it. This is what the brothers did. The children of Israel, the family of Jacob, they find themselves now in a terrible famine, living in the land of Canaan, and they have to go down to Egypt. That's when they reunite with Joseph, and they settle in the land of Goshen. Goshen was a wonderful place to live. It was big, it was spacious, they were able to be shepherds as they were accustomed to back in Canaan, and life was wonderful. And it's very similar to the beginning of many other exiles that we've been through, where it starts off pleasant, it starts off very well, the government was nice to them, they had connections, right? Joseph was second in command in all of Egypt, and you can imagine they felt pretty secure. Even though in the beginning, although things were looking good, we do see some of the early seeds of anti-Semitism. The Torah tells us a very interesting episode when the family comes down and they're going to have a meal together with Joseph. The Torah records, and the Egyptians who ate with him separately, for the Egyptians could not bear to eat with them, with the Hebrews, it being loathsome to the Egyptians. It was disgusting for the Egyptians to have to eat with Jews. And there's different interpretations as to why that was the case. One idea is because the Jewish people enjoyed lamb chops. And for the Egyptians, they viewed the lamb as one of the major deities. So we can't break bread with you. But whatever the exact reason was, it's clear that even in the good part of the exile, when things were peaceful, there is this underlying feeling the Egyptians had for the Jews that you're not one of us. The Torah actually says that the children of Israel were fruitful, teemed, increased, and became very strong. And the land became filled with them. They're having lots of kids, they're being successful. flourishing. Then the Torah writes, a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Different interpretations what that means. Some say literally a new king came to power, never knew Joseph. He did some wonderful things for us in the past, but that was in the past. And some say it was the exact same king, but he behaved in a way as if he never met Joseph. Something changed. And he said to his people, listen to this line. He says, behold, the people, the children of Israel, are more numerous and stronger than we. Come, let us deal with them wisely, lest they become numerous. And if a war will occur, they too may join our enemies and wage war against us. Pharaoh was concerned. Here I am, the President of the United States of America. That is the most powerful position on the planet. At that time, the Pharaoh of Egypt was the most powerful position on the planet. People viewed him as God on some level. And Pharaoh was afraid that if a nation comes in, the Syrians come and they attack us, we have all these Jews here, they're going to join our enemies and they're going to kill us all. We have to think of a plan. Sounds kind of paranoid. Why are you afraid that Jews are going to join your enemies? First of all, they're part of Egypt right now. They're enjoying life in Goshen. They're benefiting from the government. Why would they join the enemies? It's interesting, one of the well-known commentators in the Torah, the Sforno, lived in the 1500s, and we'll get there. He explains the rationale of Pharaoh. He said, Pharaoh looked at the Jews and he said, listen, they're very different than we are. And they're different in many ways. Number one, circumcision. Part of the covenant between God and Abraham, like we spoke about last week, was that the Jews have a special sign of circumcision. Number two, they speak differently than we do. The Jews spoke Hebrew. That was what they spoke in Canaan. When they moved to Egypt, they continued speaking Hebrew. We speak Egyptian. And number three is that they have very different philosophies than we do. So what? Who cares if they're different? So the Sforno explains the mindset of Pharaoh, that because they're different, and we don't like them because they're different, they don't like us. They hate us because they're different than we are. Right? There's an idea that we find all the time of dislike or unlike the dislike. That there's a natural feeling that if you're different than I am, I don't like you. Your skin is darker, your skin is lighter, whatever the case may be, I have to feel somewhat superior. This was somewhat of a deeper psychology. This was Pharaoh saying that you're different than us, but that means therefore you don't like us. You're the minority, but you must think that you're superior than we are. And the truth is, I found in the writings of a contemporary historian, named Gibbon, he writes as follows. He's speaking about the Jewish people, and he says, the tenacity with which the Jews have preserved their distinct religious practices and unusual ways has marked them as a distinct type of human being, hating all others. You see the psychology of Pharaoh more than 3,300 years ago, even true, alive and well in modern day. They're different than us, therefore they must hate us. Now it's interesting, you think about the Jewish religion for a second. What's our philosophy? What's our outlook towards the non-Jews? I'll give you three choices, A, B, or C. A, they're all going to burn in hell, so you might as well just kill them all. B, let's force conversion, or threaten to kill them. Or C, beautiful, they can do their thing, they're good people, they don't have to be Jewish, and that's wonderful as well, and they'll go to heaven. What would you guess, A, B, or C?
C.
So we know the answer is C. But even with that philosophy, you could have somebody like Gibbon, somebody like Pharaoh, who looks at us and says, because you're different, you must think you're superior, and therefore you must look down at us. And that was Pharaoh's philosophy. You're going to join the invading army if some army attacks, and therefore it's self-defense. We have to kill you before you kill us. And it's interesting as well, when we go throughout history, a lot of the killing that took place, it was self-defense. Otherwise the Jews are going to do who knows what. That started right here in the very first exile with Pharaoh. But he said we have to deal wisely with them. Because he knew that if he said, let's kill them all, he'd get backlash. The people of Egypt wouldn't respond to that. They wouldn't say, okay, I'll kill all the Jews. They would say, it's crazy, it's barbaric. Even the Egyptian society, and we look at them as they were like barely human, but they were civilized. And Pharaoh knew that if he would say to go kill a whole nation, there would be a revolution. It would be the Egyptian spring, right? 3,000 years early. So he couldn't say that. He had to deal wisely with them. So what did he do? He had a whole system. Number one is he said, anybody who would like to volunteer to help build these new cities, Pithom and Ramses, please come and help us. Knowing full well the Jews back then, as the Jews have always been, the Jews are very patriotic. If we're welcomed in a place, if we're living in a state or a country that welcomes us, we want to give back. We want to show our appreciation. So the first ones in line to help build these cities voluntarily were the Jews. And they were working and doing wonderful things. And then slowly, once they were already doing that, so then we shifted it a little bit and we said, you know what, it's no longer voluntary. Actually, there's a lot of financial stress in the country right now. Those who are working, we're going to make that forced labor as a form of taxation. It's only applicable to the Jews, but it was subtle. And then from there, from going to voluntary work to forced labor, Pharaoh now tells the midwives, the people involved with helping people give birth, he tells them secretly, any Jewish male boys, make sure they don't live. It wasn't a public announcement. Everything done behind the scenes. What was our response? The Torah tells us, but as much as they would afflict them, referring to the Jews, they would increase and spread out and continue to multiply. That was the response of the Jews. We feel oppression, we feel some level of persecution, it makes us stronger. Our response is, don't tell me what to do. And we only flourish based on that. It's interesting, Elie Wiesel, he has a book, The Jews of Silence, where it's basically, he goes to the Soviet Union in the 60s, and he was a journalist, wanting to find out, what were the Jews like? Everything was cut off, there was no religious connection at all. Did these Jews have any knowledge of being Jewish? Did they care at all? And he writes that, to his surprise, they had young men and women who were extremely excited about being Jewish. And at first he says he doesn't know why. But he writes that he thinks part of it is because they're not allowed to be Jewish. And that's part of the Jewish mentality. You tell me I can't do this, I'll show you I can. The joke said, if you have young men and women, and you want to find some way to inspire them, some way to motivate them more, to think about life, to get involved with Judaism, how do you do it? You give a class, you have a study group, very simple. You make it clear, you make it known to them that you're not allowed to have any connection with anything Jewish. And they're going to run to the synagogue. That's the nature of a Jew. We're stiff-necked people. It's said many times in the Torah. And on one hand, that means we're stubborn, which is something that's not the best quality. But it's that same exact quality of being stubborn and being able to say, you're persecuting me, I'm going to get stronger. That's part of the reason we're still here today. So that was the response of the Jews. They kept on growing, they kept on flourishing. But Pharaoh's tactic did work. And eventually, he got the Egyptians to view us as subhuman. The Torah says, and they, referring to the Egyptians, became disgusted because of the children of Israel. They were disgusted by us. It was brilliant. Once we have this structure, once you've set up a system where the Jews are the manual labor, the forced manual labor, now you're enabling people to view us in a subhuman way. For us sitting in this room, I hope it's true for all of us, the idea of owning a black person and having them work for you against their will is something that's mind-boggling. But put yourself in a situation, go back 200 years, you're born on a plantation in the South, and your whole life you grow up with 10 black people working for you as slaves. And there's a natural feeling, because that's my whole society and everything that I've been taught, Yeah, they're lower than we are. They're not the same level of human. Of course, I wouldn't question that. Most people didn't question that. And that's what Pharaoh was able to create. He put the Jews in a lower class of society, enabling the rest of the Egyptians to view us and almost become disgusted by us. That was what led to the persecution of Egypt. Walks along a man into history, a man who didn't necessarily want to be part of the glitz and the glamour, didn't feel he was ready for that position, but somewhat forced into it against his will. This man is no other than Moses. In Hebrew, Moshe. What do we know about Moses? He was put in a basket. That's true. We know about the fact he was born, and this is after the decree that every male Jewish child should be killed, and they put him in the basket in the Nile. And miraculously, the daughter of Pharaoh saw him, and she thought he was a cute little baby. She had compassion, and she took him into her home and became somewhat of a mother to Moshe. Now it's interesting. This is a discrepancy between the movie and what actually took place. I haven't seen the movie in a while, but my recollection is that in the Ten Commandments, he was brought up thinking that he was a total Egyptian, not knowing until much later on in life that he was actually Jewish. True?
Right.
That's what the movie says.
Right. Yes.
Not true, though.
Right. Okay.
It's very clear from the Torah sources that he was brought up in the palace of Pharaoh. But as we know, Miriam, his sister, hello. We know Miriam, his sister, wasn't passive by nature. And she wanted to make things happen, and she wanted to make sure her brother would survive. So she orchestrated a plan, and she goes and she tells the daughter of Pharaoh, if you're looking for someone to nurse the child and take care of him, I know just the woman. And lo and behold, she gets her mother, right, the official biological mother of Moses, Yocheved, and she really raises Moses for the first couple of years of his life. And she, from the very young age, teaches Moshe what it means to be a Jew. She makes it clear that you're part of this nation that's in captivity. So what happened in the movie did not take place in reality. He was aware from the youngest of ages who he was and that the fact he was part of the Jewish nation. That was not a surprise. The first introduction, the first encounter we have with Moshe in the Torah is very interesting. It says that he grew up, and we know it doesn't just mean biologically or physically, but mentally, spiritually, emotionally, he became a man. And there's different opinions actually as to how old he was. Some say he was 20, some say he was 40. 40 years old, then you're finally a man. He leaves the palace to see his brother and sisters in captivity. The Torah tells us he sees an Egyptian beating mercilessly a Jew. He turned this way and that way and saw that there was no man. So he struck down the Egyptian and hit him in the sand. Most people think that means that there is no one around. That's not what it says. It says there was no man. There were many people around, but there was no one willing to stand up and take care of this injustice. This is the perfect example of who he was as a person. He didn't want to get involved. He didn't want to show that he was a hero. He had no, motivation or agenda to show off. But somebody was getting beaten, and no one's doing anything about it, so I have to do something. It's a necessity. This is what the Mishnah tells us. We haven't got to the Mishnah yet, but we'll get there. But one of the passages in the Mishnah is, "B'makom she'ein hanoshim," in a place, in a time, in a situation where there's no men, hishtadel liyosish, strive to be a man. If no one's taking care of something, then step up to the plate and do it yourself. And it's true, once again, we'll see throughout all Jewish history, the idea of just complaining or bemoaning or, oh, I wish it could be better, that's not a Jewish trait. We're stiff-necked, like we said before. And that means, if something's not going the way it should be, I'm going to fix it. That was the trait we saw in Moshe. That was one idea. The second thing we see in Moshe is the fact that he was a shepherd. What's significant about being a shepherd?
You
Huh?
You lead them around, right?
Yeah, you're a leader,
lamb
probably
loves.
engenders good leadership qualities.
You're a lamb lot.
You,
Alone and a lot.
you're alone a lot. You're in solitude, which is a good recipe for either becoming crazy,
Oh.
or if used correctly, through meditation, and in Hebrew it's referred to as hisbodinus, it's a good way to become more spiritual. Yeah?
I'm sorry. Someone brought up an example before about a shepherd and his herd. And the herd eventually is going to be killed. And that's the whole purpose of having those sheep, isn't it?
No, sheep.
They're also used for their wool.
They get
What's that?
sheared.
Also used for their wool.
Yeah, but I mean, you're taking away something from it, and then the other purpose is to take away its life. And I beforehand, you would always hear about the shepherd. It's supposed to be a positive metaphor for the Jewish people in Moshe. But if you think about it, the sheep are either their wool is being taken from them, or they're going to die eventually. That's their whole purpose. So what's that comparing? That's comparing us to sheep.
Well, I'm not sure actually making the comparison, that Moshe was leading the flock as if he was leading us. Just that occupation of being a shepherd in general does lend itself to, number one, having more time alone, being able to really think about life and being able to work on spirituality. It also engenders leadership qualities. So regardless of what's going to happen to the sheep afterwards, there are definitely positive things that come from that experience. It's interesting, a lot of the Jewish leaders were shepherds. We know that King David was a shepherd. That was also part of his stepping up into greatness. We have an ancient source that tells us that God never brings someone to a great position without first testing them on very small, insignificant things. And the example given is in regards to Moses, in regards to King David. Let me first see how they do being a shepherd. Are they going to let their sheep graze on other people's property? Are they going to take care of them and be compassionate with them? Are they going to allow one to stray off? Let me first see the small things. And then once I see you're a mensch, once I see that you're a good, functional human being, then I can take you to higher levels of greatness. So that's one thing we see as well in regards to Moshe. The third thing is the fact that he was humble. The Torah tells us he was the most humble person ever to live. By the episode of the burning bush, which we'll discuss in a moment, God tells Moses, "You're the man. I want you to go down and take out the people from Egypt." Moshe's response was, "Mi anochi? Who am I? Why me?" So there's a humility factor here. I think what's interesting is that he was a questioner. We have the episode of the burning bush, where God comes to him in this very awesome vision and tells him, after living in solitude for many years, right, he moved to Midian after this whole episode of killing the Egyptian, and in Midian he married a young lady, Tzipporah, and they had a family together, and there he was, living a life of quiet and tranquility. And then God comes to him in this vision of the burning bush and says, "You're the leader of the Jewish people, go down to Egypt, take out my nation." And his response is, "Who am I?" And there's a back and forth. When you think about it, that's a chutzpah. What audacity, right? The limitless, all-powerful, eternal creator of all reality is telling you, "You're the man, trust me." And the response is, no, my brother Aaron, he's an amazing fellow, 3 years older than I am, very accomplished, and that doesn't work. You should know, I can't speak very well. I'm not charismatic, I'm not articulate. That doesn't work. What is he doing? You're questioning God? The answer is yes. Just like we saw in regards to Abraham. God said, "I'm going to destroy the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah," and the response of Abraham was, "Okay, do what your will is." No. The response was, "Can we figure out a different way? Is there any other approach we could take?" Not questioning from the perspective of, "You're crazy, and how can you say such a thing? I realize you're an infinite being, but I have to understand what's being said." So in this case, here's Moses getting instructions, but he feels, I don't understand why I'm the man for the job. And I have to question, and I have to question more. He was there for 7 days. People don't realize that. He was at the burning bush for 7 days, going back and forth until finally God said, "Enough, just go." And they just went. That's the idea of being a questioner. I think the ultimate quality, though, that we see in Moses is the fact that he was a human being. He wasn't godlike. He wasn't supernatural. He was a normal human being. He was born just like you and I. He lived just like you and I. And he died. And when he died, the Torah tells us that his grave is not known to any man. Why? Because God didn't want that to become a place where people would go and start worshiping and start praying to Moses. That's not Judaism. Every human being is a human being and nothing more. Now, he accomplished amazing things in his lifetime. The spiritual heights that he reached were things that we can't even fathom. But ultimately, he was a human being, and he had many successes, and he had many failures as well. And the Torah seems to be very clear about all the failures of all the great leaders of the Jewish people. We speak about Abraham's failure, about Moses, about Aaron, everyone, which is very unique when it comes to a religious text. Isn't the goal to worship these people and to say, you know, these are amazing and almost supernatural human beings? No. The goal is to see what they accomplished and to strive to get even close to that level of accomplishment. But at the same time, the goal is to learn from their lives, to learn from their success, to learn from their failures, to learn from them as people. That was perhaps the most amazing thing about Moses, is the fact that he was human, he was mortal. And there's a funny thing. At the burning bush, God says to Moses, what's the first thing God says? Well, okay, so right at the beginning of the conversation, God says something to Moses. Remove your shoes. It would make sense if you're visiting your bubby and you're about to step on the carpet. He says, please take off your shoes before you make my carpet dirty. God didn't have any carpet. It was dirt. Why did he care about Moses taking off his shoes? So I'll share with you an interesting Kabbalistic idea. In mystical thought, the body of a human being is actually referred to as a shoe. The reason is, what is a shoe? Think about it. A little thing that basically allows me to move around and function in this world. And I can walk without stubbing my toes or stepping on things or getting my feet dirty. That's what a shoe is. Does the shoe cover or encompass my entire being? No, it just allows me to be here. That's what a body is. A body is not at all who I am. It's not even a casing, so to speak, of my essence. It's just a form that allows me, the essential me, the spiritual me, to be here in this world. This world can't take the sanctity, so to speak, of what it means, the soul. Can't be. This world is finite, it's physical. There has to be some form of covering. But it's only a shoe. The real me, the real human being, towers above the body, so to speak. So what God was saying to Moses, take off your shoe. In order to have this type of communication, this level of spirituality, you have to remove yourself completely from the physical. It's referred to in Hebrew as hispashtus hagashmi. Tap into that mindset of becoming a totally intellectual, spiritual being, and then we can have this communication. Then you can tap into a different realm. So he was clearly on a very high level, but at the same time he was human. So now he goes down to Egypt, and we have the Jewish people. They've been enslaved for 210 years. They've been in captivity for 210 years. And in that time, they've been greatly influenced by the Egyptian culture. Many of them were into idol worship. Many of them lost the vision of Abraham, so to speak, and lost the basic philosophy of what they were taught from their grandfather and great-grandfather. And they were very much part of the culture. It was enticing. It was glamorous. At the same time, though, we have sources that tell us there were three things that the Jews never changed. Throughout all the time in Egypt, they kept three things. Number one, they dressed the same as they always did. They came from Canaan, they had a particular type of dress, whatever that was. In Egypt, they never wore Egyptian clothing. They only wore Jewish clothing. Number two, they kept their language, like we mentioned earlier. They spoke Hebrew. They were there for many years. I'm sure they learned Egyptian, but they chose to speak Hebrew. Number three is they kept their Jewish names. It's interesting, in the Torah, many of the names, you'll find Elitzur, My God is my strength. Amiel, the nation of God. Michael, who is like God. Names that have a connotation, names that have an expression of their belief. Those are the three things they held on strong to. Are any of those three things obligations? Anywhere in the Torah does it tell us you're obligated to dress like a Jew? It does.
Tzitzis.
Well, tzitzis is something in particular, right? When you have a four-cornered garment, you have to put on
So
tzitzis.
isn't that part of our clothing? What makes our clothing? Like today, like you have Jews who dress different kinds. You have Chabadniks who dress
It's
this
just
way.
style.
No, it's not-
It's all it is, it's style.
I'm just saying,
It's not
tzitzis is
Torah.
a universal Jewish thing.
True, right? We do have universal dress in regards to the tzitzis. But can you see my tzitzis?
Well, I mean, to each his own. You probably hide it in your pants.
Right, but I'm wearing it.
Yes.
But obviously, therefore, it's not an obligation to look a certain way. But yet, somehow they felt that was very important. Is there an obligation to only name your children a Jewish name? There's a point in history which we'll discuss where every Jewish boy was named Alexander, after Alexander the Great. Alexander's not a Jewish name. Is there any obligation to only speak Hebrew? No. But somehow they felt that by doing these things, that would connect them, that would keep them focused, at least on some level, to who they were, to what they stand for. So we have a dichotomy. On one hand, they're very much influenced by the culture around them. On the other hand, they were keeping strong, at least on a traditional level, the Jewish ideals. What was the ultimate merit? What was the reason they were finally redeemed from Egypt? It was the women. The Talmud tells us it was based on the righteous women that enabled the Jews to leave Egypt. What did they do that was so great? You can imagine the husbands, they're working the whole day, crazy back-breaking labor. To live a normal family life, to have a decent relationship with your wife and your kids, it's very difficult. And therefore many of the men pretty much gave up. It was the women, they would come out into the fields, they would sneak up to where their husbands were working, and they would motivate them. And they would speak to them endearingly, and they would make sure that the Jewish family structure between parents and children, between husband and wife, was not going to be broken. In regards to every aspect of the relationship, they made sure that things would continue as normal as possible. It was therefore, says the Talmud, which we'll discuss what that is later, in the merit of the women, that's when the Jews were freed. And this is also, I think, a continual theme throughout Jewish history. A lot of the success of the Jewish people is based on the women. They're the backbone of the family structure. And the family structure is what creates communal structure. If the family structure is intact, then there's room, then there's potential for a healthy community and a healthy nation. If the family structure is not intact, that goes out the window. So ultimately, that's why they were redeemed, based on the women. The Exodus, as we know, an amazing event, 10 plagues that lasted a year. People don't realize that. Each plague was a long time. 10 plagues altogether was 1 year of devastation in the entire Egypt, which was the central part of all civilization, was destroyed. Many people were killed, many things were totally obliterated. The first Passover Seder takes place, which is the night of the 10th plague, the plague of the firstborn. God tells the Jews through Moses, gives them very interesting instructions. Take a lamb, go outside, kill it, then have a barbecue, and then eat it inside that night, the night of the 15th of the month of Nisan. And you're going to leave the following morning. You would think of all the commandments in the Torah to have a barbecue, somewhat hard to understand. The idea is, like we mentioned earlier, the lamb was one of the main deities of Egyptian idolatry. And the Jews were very influenced by that. Up until this point, God was doing the work for the Jews, so to speak. He was going through and doing the 10 plagues, showing miracles, making it very clear to the Jews and the Egyptians that there is a creator of the universe who is in charge and control of destiny. But that was all God's doing. God said, in order for you now to be ready to leave Egypt, you have to do something yourself. You have to demonstrate to the culture around you and to yourselves that you do not believe in their idolatry. You have a very different philosophy. And the only way to do that, to make that real, don't just say it. Don't just give me lip service. Go outside, take their God in front of their face, and kill it, and barbecue it, and enjoy it. That was the commandment. And they did that. And that was the night they put the blood on the doorpost to make it very clear, we don't think this is a God. The next morning, we know they left. This was in the secular year 1313 BCE, which corresponds to the Jewish year 2448 after the creation of the first human being. So here we are on the chart. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. So now we're in the year 2448 is the year the Jewish people left Egypt. They come 7 days later, and they're confronted with the Yam Suf. The Yam Suf is translated as either the Red Sea or the Sea of Reeds. And as you can imagine, being in that situation, you have the raging sea in front of you and the approaching Egyptian army behind you. What do? You panic. And that's what they did. What does Moses do? Moses, being the leader, what else do you do? You turn to God and you scream, God, please help us! What's God's response to Moses? Lama titzak. Why are you crying out to me? Go forward. There's a time for prayer. And there's always a time for prayer. In all areas, in all situations in life. But sometimes the answer is right now, don't pray. Go forward. Go into the raging sea. That's what they did. And that was when the miracle of the splitting of the Red Sea happened. But also, I think a common theme we're going to see throughout many areas, many times in Jewish history, where there is no other option. But going forward doesn't seem like it's the best approach, but there's no other approach. And therefore we say, go forward. Have the strength. Continue. In Yiddish we say, weiter. You gotta go weiter. You gotta keep on going. That's what they did by the splitting of the Red Sea. That's what led to that miracle, which was perhaps the most miraculous episode that took place in that whole Exodus. They cross the sea. The Egyptian army, we know, pursues them. They're swallowed up in the ocean, in the sea. And then comes a song. And the song is referred to as the Song of the Sea, where the men led by Moses and the women led by Miriam, they start singing a spontaneous form of prophecy. It wasn't just a song they had the words to and the lyrics all figured out before. Somehow they were on such an elevated level at that time with their recognition and their appreciation, they all sang together the exact same words. Moses with the men, Miriam with the women. 50 days after they left Egypt, they came to the purpose, the reason why they left. Many times we celebrate Passover and we think of the idea of freedom as an end unto itself. They were free. Yay, beautiful, okay. The freedom itself was only in order to live a life of purpose. Freedom without purpose, freedom without being able to live a meaningful existence is worthless. It's better than being a slave, but it's not meaningful. The purpose of that freedom took place exactly 50 days after they left Egypt. They came to the desert of Sinai, and they stood around the Mount Sinai. Where that mountain is an interesting discussion amongst many historians, and there's many different interpretations. It doesn't really make a difference. They stood under the mountain, and besides, like we mentioned last time, besides the fact that there was a creation to the world, as probably being the most significant point in all of history, besides that, the most influential, the most powerful, the most awesome experience ever to take place took place right by that mountain 3,325 years ago. What happened? Once again, what does the movie say happened? Moses had this experience, he had this vision, he had this communication, and then he communicated that to the Jewish people. That's not what happened. What happened was, the Torah tells us very clearly in many, many places, that the entire nation had a revelation. There was a communication, which is the only time this ever took place in history. There's a creator of the world we spoke about last week. But when in history was there ever a communication where the creator tells us, this is what you're here for? A lot of that perhaps could be somewhat intuitive. We have feelings of what's good and what's not, what's appropriate, what's true, things to stay away from, but there's a lot of gray in life. There's a lot of things we don't know. And how to connect with an infinite being is surely above our own comprehension. At that point in history, that was the one time where the creative reality said, let me tell you what reality is about. Let me tell you why you're here. That was the revelation at Har Sinai and Mount Sinai. Has there ever been, there's tens of thousands of religions in the world, with all sorts of interesting claims. Has there ever been another claim by any other religion or any other philosophy that says that the creator of the universe communicated with millions of people? There hasn't. Why? Such a great claim. So powerful. So much more powerful than, well, I was on my donkey and I was in the desert and I happened to see this amazing vision and he told me that you have to listen to what I'm going to tell you. Much more powerful to come to an entire nation. And when you think about the religions that were built off Judaism, think of Christianity, think of Islam, where the basic perspective is, Jesus comes along and he says, you know what, boys, the Torah is true. Of course we believe in what happened at Mount Sinai more than 3,300 years ago, but God has changed his mind. The commandments, the instructions, the obligations in the Torah are no longer relevant. God tried it, it was an experiment, it failed. So now we're starting over again. And he actually came to me and said, I'm going to be the one. I'm going to be the leader, and we're going to start a new religion. Wouldn't that have been more powerful? It was really Paul. Paul was the spokesman. Paul was the marketing agent for Christianity. And he was brilliant. He was brilliant at what he did. But wouldn't it have been more powerful if he would have said, God came to millions of people and he said, ladies and gentlemen, we're starting over again. The Jews failed. We're now going to start with somebody named Jesus. That would have been a much better claim. If God started off with a big public affair, you would think if he wanted to change things around, he would do so in a similar fashion. In regards to Islam, we have basically a similar story where Muhammad comes into the picture. Also, what happened at Mount Sinai, of course, is true. We can't deny that. But God now told me he wants me to be the new prophet and also do things very differently. If you're going to make up that claim, it should be in a national, public setting. The reason why no other nation, no other religion, no other anything has ever claimed such a crazy, radical claim is for one simple reason. The only way to claim something like that is if it actually took place. Very hard to fabricate a national revelation of God communicating to 3 million people. The Rambam writes, and we'll discuss him as well when we get there. The Rambam writes, why do we believe in the Torah? Why do we believe it in this particular book? Is it because Moses did amazing miracles and the 10 plagues and the crossing of the Red Sea? He says, no. Even if I saw those myself, that wouldn't cause me to believe. Because ultimately, who knows how these things happen? Maybe somebody was using black magic or he had other creative ways of orchestrating nature. There's one reason, writes the Rambam, and one reason only, why we believe in the Torah. Why we believed in Moses being the official prophet, so to speak, of God. And that reason is this episode in history. The fact that there is a public communication, the fact that every single Jew was there and they had an eyewitness testimony, an eyewitness experience, says the Rambam, that's why we believe. Because that's something you can't fabricate. That's something that, if this is what's said in history, and this is what's been passed down from generation to generation without any break, that's true. That's the source of our belief, and therefore, probably one of the most fundamental, most pivotal points in all of world history. Where does that leave us? Here we are. We didn't cover nearly as much ground as we did last week. Last week we went through 2,000 years in an hour. This week we find ourselves the year 2448, so we covered almost 500 years. Right after the giving of the Torah, the Jewish nation, after living in Egypt for many years, being in servitude, becoming very influenced by their ways, but yet at the same time keeping strong, keeping the faith in regards to the least external things. Now they come 50 days later after leaving, they come to the mountain of Mount Sinai, They have this amazing national revelation, and here we have the Jewish people. In a sense, this is their birth. In a sense, up until now has been a prelude. At this point, when they actually had this communication, they were given the mission officially. It was no longer just the vision of Abraham that's being passed down. It was no longer somewhat of a national thing, but it was now a real, this is religion. This is Torah. This is the Jewish nation. And we're going to stop at this point and hopefully continue next time with what happened afterwards, the time in the desert, when they enter into Israel, that experience in setting up the first temple. I look forward to continuing. Any questions? Yeah.
I was going to say was that I actually heard that there's, it was more recently that in India there actually was millions of people who witnessed.
They all died.
They what?
They all died after.
Oh, they did?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Never
So
mind.
apparently, the question is, how do we know that they did it since they all died? Because it was a legend.
Okay, that's a good point.
Any other questions or comments?
I don't
Okay. Have a wonderful evening.
know. One of those speeches.
Really?